Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Senator Brown started his remarks speaking of a Swiss ski resort. I presume he was referring to Davos, where the President addressed the World Economic Forum last week. To my knowledge, in Davos, all they do is have their party once a year. But in another Swiss ski resort, Basel, they purport to exercise great authority without accountability at the Financial Stability Board. So let's address what happens in that Swiss ski resort. Mr. Secretary, I and other members of the committees recently sent the administration a letter which raised concerns about the operation of the Financial Stability Board. We're concerned that it's morphed into a kind of global regulatory body using its peer review mechanism as a quasi-enforcement tool to pressure U.S. companies into adopting global standards. I'm concerned about that kind of regulatory creep into U.S. jurisdictions, especially considering how dissimilar our financial markets are from many foreign markets. For example, we have thousands of small lenders, we have independent asset managers, and we have an insurance industry regulated by our states primarily. So simple question, are FSB rules voluntary or binding?
They're voluntary.
Are they suitable to be used as precedents in U.S. courts, by regulatory agencies, or in private litigation?
Again, I'm going to defer to the lawyers on that, but my view is not necessarily.
Thank you. In 2015, 4 Chinese banks sought an exemption from an FSB rule related to how much capital they have to hold. Given that I agree with you that these rules are voluntary, it's strange that they would have to seek an exemption from such a rule. Can you imagine a scenario in which a U.S. bank or firm would have to seek an exemption from an FSB rule?
Again, the U.S. banks are regulated by the U.S. regulators. I think the purpose of the international standards from our standpoint is to make sure that there's a level playing field for our banks, and that to the extent that foreign banks have a lot less capital, that there are certain standards that they would adhere to, but that is not legally binding.
Thank you. Let's talk now about the FSOC process for identifying systemically important financial institutions, especially under the last administration as it relates to the FSB. In July 2013, the FSB determined that 3 U.S. insurers, AIG, MetLife, and Prudential, were globally systemic important insurers. But at that time, only AIG had been designated by the FSOC as a systemically important institution in the United States. Prudential wasn't designated as a SIFI by FSOC until September of 2013, MetLife not until December of 2014. Since the FSB operates by consensus, however, this means that for months before the FSOC designated either Prudential or MetLife as SIFI, your predecessor at Treasury and the chair of the Fed, 2 of the most important members at FSOC, had already determined as members of the FSB to designate Prudential and MetLife as globally systemically important. So I would assume that if a firm is systemically important on a global scale, it must be systemically important in its own home country. I wonder then how the FSOC designation process in the last administration for Prudential and MetLife could be considered fair and objective. The Treasury and the Fed, after all, had already determined as members of the FSB that they were globally systemic. Do you believe that this decision was simply a show trial by the FSOC in 2013 and 2014?
Senator, since I wasn't there, I can't comment on specifically, although I understand your concerns. I would say fundamentally I do believe that there should be better transparency at FSOC to the extent that companies are designated. They should understand why they're designated and the basis of the risks.
Can we be certain that we will not see a repeat of such a scenario in which the FSB designates a U.S. firm as globally systemically important before the FSOC designates it as systemically important in the United States?
I would not expect that to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a very important issue. Financial experts around the world haven't exactly covered themselves in glory for the last 25 years. Our nations, not just the United States, but in Europe, have faced some turbulent political times with populist candidates and parties on both sides, right and left, across our nations, defeating more conventional politicians and parties because of the failure of our country's leaders to deliver stable, prosperous conditions for our citizens. I think it's important to remember that we are countries that are governed by our citizens, not by our experts, certainly not by unelected experts at Swiss ski resorts.